this computer. Yeah, and when I record this, it will be saved and put on the PDA-CA YouTube channel. And so everyone who either attended or who registered and forgot to attend or whatever, I'll send them the link so that they can have the opportunity to review this or share it with other people that didn't know about this in time. We have 3 speakers tonight, all amazing. One going to be talking about San Francisco, one going to be talking about Oakland, and the third person's going to be talking about the Bay Area and potentially the whole state. I don't know if we have time for the whole state. It's a big state, right? And let's start with our San Francisco person. And this is Tyler. He's up in my right-hand corner, but he's probably somewhere else in everybody else's. Tyler's an organizer with Hotels Not Hospitals. And he has over 10 years experiencing fighting on the front lines against displacement in San Francisco and the Bay Area as a tenant attorney representing low-income tenants. Currently, Tyler serves as the directing attorney at the Shelter Client Advocate Program at the Eviction Defense Collaborative in San Francisco. And I'm thinking that many people don't even know that exists. So I'm glad you're doing this very important work, and I'm now going to mute everyone. Let's see, where is that? Okay. Mute all. There we are. Okay. So, Tyler, take it away. And I have to make you a co-host just in case you want to share. So let me do that. And if you don't want to share, that's okay too.
I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks,
Perfect.
Shirley.
You're co-host now.
Okay, fantastic. So yes, my name is Tyler Rougeau, and I'll just preface everything by everything I say here today is my own personal view. Maybe others share it, maybe they don't, but they certainly don't reflect the view of my employer. So don't take it to mean anything that EDC is signing on to what I'm saying here. But thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to give you my perspective. I'm an organizer with the Hotels Not Hospitals project. I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing, the state of things in San Francisco as I see it, where H Hotels Not Hospitals is going, what we're trying to achieve, our vision of like the real solutions to the housing/homelessness crisis, and we'll also touch on the city budget a bit, try to work that in. So a little background about me other than my employment. I experienced homelessness as a teenager through a sequence of events that aren't really relevant. But one thing that I learned from that experience that stayed with me over the years is the realization I had that I was practically living in a different world than other people. I remember quite vividly a moment in particular where I was sitting on a couch with a friend of mine who had maintained, friendship with, who wasn't homeless at the time, and he offered me a bag of chips. And I was never on the brink of starvation, but daily hunger was part of my existence. It was part of my reality. And it was nice for him to do that. But in that moment, I vividly remember just having the realization that even though he knew my situation, it was just outside of the scope of what he understood, that just we were living in different worlds. And although I was working 2 jobs, I couldn't afford a place to live. I spent a lot of time walking the streets, and it was very obvious to me that the world that I was experiencing and living in was different than the people that I would pass by on the street. In my view, homelessness and housing insecurity is a systemic feature of a society in which housing is a commodity that's produced and allocated in search of profit as opposed to allocated based on human need. At the same time, our society normalizes excluding people from housing. And keeping people homeless, it justifies this through personal and group demonization of people who are experiencing homelessness, who only crime is that they don't have money to pay a landlord to rent a place to live. Our society creates an underclass of people who are experiencing homelessness, who are stripped of rights, deprived of access to the necessary conditions for humane, dignified existence, and even denied like a square foot to rest for a moment. You know, physical space is excluded from human beings based on whether they have money, whether they have access to capital. My experience has been that most people have a conscious disconnect from this reality that some people are living in. Even people who are compassionate, who try their best to act to create a better world, including for people who are experiencing homelessness, it's really difficult for someone to understand the reality without having experienced it. So, you know, a few things that I want to touch on about the San Francisco budget and the city's allocation of money to address housing and homelessness is, you know, I'll get into a second. I want to preface some of what I'm about to say, that I think the focus on public money spending is a little bit of a red herring. You know, the city, the public will manifest as public policy, and allocation of tax dollars should reflect a just and equitable society. But simply devoting money to an issue is not itself a solution. And you know, I'm not by any means like a fiscal conservative. I think the city should be spending a lot more money on housing and on homelessness. But fundamentally, I think we need to question whether the money that we're spending, whether the structure and the framework that we're using actually has a reasonable chance of solving the issue that it's being tasked to solve. So it's not so much about whether, you know, the dollars are being used efficiently or whether there's accountability for the money that's spent. I mean, that's definitely important, but the larger issue is whether there's actually a reasonable chance for success for these institutions that we're putting money into. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the numbers that are at play in the homelessness response system in the San Francisco budget. So a little background: the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, HSH, in San Francisco was created in 2016. In 2017, the department created a 5-year strategic framework for the years 2018 through 2022. I'm gonna try and share my screen here, and I'm gonna try and jump through this kind of quick because I got half an hour is not a lot of time to go through all of this. So here is the strategic framework. Let me know if you, well, maybe not in agreement if you can see it because you're all muted. But you should see on the screen the 2018-2022 strategic framework. And that was created in 2017. The whole crux of this document, which is PowerPoint, which is how HSH puts out a lot of their policies, is coordinated entry. If we look at, you know, a couple of these pages here, coordinated entry was a system that was implemented by HSH. It's the current system that's used. And what this document is talking about in the 5-year strategic framework is this coordinated entry system. So I'll get to that a little bit in a moment, but right now the budget process is still ongoing. We had a vote recently, the Board of Supervisors. Dean Preston was the sole dissenting vote, you know, kind of peripherally paying attention to it, but it seems like the budget as it is now is going to be the budget that's that is passed. And in that budget, because it has to go through a couple rounds, it has to get, you know, approved and all of that, but it seems like this is going to be it from my view. So HSH, the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, their budget is $184 million less in the 2021-2022 fiscal year than it was this last fiscal year that we're coming out of. The difference is between $670 million for this upcoming fiscal year versus $185 million that went through Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing in that fiscal year that just ended. For the 2022 to 2023 fiscal year, because it's a 2-year budget, the department is set to see another $70 million from the 2021-2022 budget. These figures that I'm quoting exclude the administrative budget for the department. So this is money that's supposed to be, going out for the homelessness response system, not kind of like just the department salaries and all of that. That's about $12.7 million for the upcoming fiscal year. So 61 million of the $670 million budget is going to nonprofits that the department contracts with for supportive housing and other homelessness services. That number is basically unchanged from the last fiscal year. And I'll note that of these aggregate numbers that I'm talking about, it reflects the Prop C, Our City, Our Home funds, which is $300 million for the last fiscal year and $250 million for 2021 to 2022, and then the same for 2022, 2023. And then we also have included in that amount the FEMA funds, and those FEMA funds are reimbursement funds to the city of $140 million. So those FEMA funds run out in September 2021. That was the last that I saw. So it's counted as a loss in the city budget because they're not going to get them this upcoming year. So they received them for the last fiscal year. They're not going to receive them for the next one. I think I just got muted. Hopefully everybody heard what I was saying. In the aggregate, it's the amount of money that that the mayor proposed in the budget that went to the Board of Supervisors. So there wasn't a drastic change that happened at the board. It's basically the same. So what does this mean? It's basically the same path as we had before, in my view. We don't see a reduction in homelessness. We see a management of the problem rather than addressing of the causes. From 2017, when the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing had the strategic framework implemented, to 2019, the last year we have the statistics, the point in time count, which is the official count of how many people are out on the street experiencing homelessness in San Francisco, the number of people during that time experiencing homelessness went up 1,000 people. It was an increase. Here, I'm going to show you that document just so you don't have to take my word for it. Sorry, I should be a little quicker on this. Here is the homelessness count. All right, can you see that? So we have 2017 numbers, and this is an undercount. We all know that it's an undercount, but it's kind of the best, I guess, that the city is working with. They're not, I don't think, too wildly inaccurate, but anyway, so we have over 1,000 people in that time period. So, we have maybe not a doubling down, but we have a continuation of the same process, which is the coordinated entry process. The best way that I could explain it is to quote somebody else. It's maybe one of the better explanations that I've heard of the coordinated entry system. And this comes from Joe Wilson and Mary Kate, who are the co-chairs of the Homeless Emergency Service Providers Association, also known as HESPA. I'm going to show you a quote and just read it from an article in Shelter Force that Mary Kate published. And let me pull that up. All right. Joe Wilson, the executive director of Hospitality House in San Francisco, puts it bluntly: coordinated entry is a classic case of shrinking the problem to fit the solution. Coordinated entry systems deliberately work backward from an inadequate supply of housing using eligibility criteria, assessment tools, and prioritization standards to justify rationing it out to a small minority. It is a system built to rationalize an unconscionable mismatch between housing options and unhoused people. As Eubanks writes, this is a book that's mentioned in the article, coordinated entry is a machine for producing rationalization. Here's how it works in San Francisco. Unhoused people presenting for services get entered into a centralized database, and trained staff apply several layers of assessments that weed them out of the running for housing. That's pretty incredible. The first layer is an eligibility assessment. Only people who meet the definition of homeless can be enrolled. The second layer is a service called quote unquote problem solving, an effort to divert people from the system they've entered into by solving some problem related to their homelessness, like paying an unpaid utility bill. The third layer is a primary assessment, a standardized set of deeply personal questions about medical and mental health problems, experiences of physical or sexual violence, and other sensitive topics designed to probe how vulnerable each person is compared to the others. The answers get fed into a ranking algorithm which reduces each household's vulnerabilities to a single numerical score. Each score gets assessed against a threshold score. At or above the threshold, and the household is deemed housing referral status, quote unquote, meaning they scored high enough to get a housing referral. Below the threshold, and the household is deemed problem solving status, meaning they scored too low to get housing. Instead, they get cycled back for another round of problem solving services, which didn't work the first time, mainly because people are homeless, and problem solving is designed to solve problems other than homelessness. So what mentioned, I mean, that's better than I could have put it. What else is mentioned in that article and is important to note is that coordinated entry as a system was not designed, the tool that's being used, the tool that's being used wasn't designed to make the decision for housing. It was an assessment tool meant to aid decision makers in how to help people into housing. But right now it's the decision-making tool. So we have, like, in a way, the tool running the show, which is one of the things that HESPA, when they presented to the local homeless coordinating board at their last meeting in San Francisco, which is, for those not familiar, it's a body that's set up, mandated by cities that receive HUD funds to set up. It's a body that's supposed to advise cities and different locations about how their homeless response system is going. And HESPA gave a presentation at the last one, really articulating a number of critiques of the coordinated entry system and how that really we shouldn't be shrinking the problem. But anyway, if we look at the approach that San Francisco has, it's really apt to say that we're shrinking the problem to fit the solution. If we look at new housing in San Francisco, the deeply affordable housing is lagging behind market rate housing, which is exceeding the quotas. I've got another just quick document that I can show to you of housing inventory here. Let's see, yeah, I'll share my screen. So this is just a little snapshot here of some housing. We have market rate and 120 above. The deficit is non-existent. If you look at the very low affordable, below market housing, the numbers just go up. So the housing that's coming into the market is not meeting our own quotas for the below market for the affordable housing, which is part of the problem. But really the point that I'm trying to get across is that that's not the fundamental issue, because we should try to be mindful when we're looking at the city's response and our social response to homelessness and the housing crisis, not to do what coordinated entry does, which is fashion a response based on the solution that we already have in mind. So when we have market rate units that are entering into the market, that's a policy choice that we're making to have unaffordable housing. That's housing that's not going to go for somebody, not going to help somebody get off of the street. It's not going to house somebody who's being excluded from housing. So it's a choice being made even before there's any sort of PowerPoint presentation being made by Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing. What we're doing is we're accepting that housing is a commodity produced for profit rather than to meet human need. And then we're deciding to work around the edges of that framework in order to fashion a solution to address a problem that we all agree is a problem. But we don't want to look at the larger issue of why people in the first place are being excluded from housing. So we're not tackling the systemic causes of what we're trying to deal with. So we're creating a new system to manage the problem rather than create a solution. So FEMA, during coronavirus, the city left millions of dollars on the table and several thousand people on the street by refusing to house everybody indoors with FEMA money. Instead, the city capped itself at about 2,200 people and is currently in the process of evicting them. Some into housing, some into shelters, some onto the street. That isn't reflected in the budget, but for us watching it and living through it in real time, it is and was pretty astonishing, even for a cynic like myself.
2 minutes, Tyler.
What's that?
2 minutes.
Okay.
Sorry.
There's no way I'm going to get through it. Okay. So what I'm going to pitch to you now is a very truncated version of what I had prepared for Hotels Not Hospitals. What we've done is we ourselves crowdsourced money and help people who were left out of the shelter in place order on the street get into hotels. We then we did this ourselves because nobody else was going to do it, which I was going to go into, but I can't. So from there, we rented housing, and we now have folks who are living in apartments, and we have the goal of sustaining these apartments with monthly donations from community members. What we have is a community supported housing model that we're trying to, one, sustain with monthly donations and also get other people to replicate, because as communities, as you know, like just individual members at $50 a month, 150 people can keep all of the folks that we're housing housed. It's super much cheaper than what the city is doing. It's something that we could be doing right now. It's something that we are doing right now, and other people could be doing it. And aside from just like providing the service, there's the change that needs to happen on our end, as we're not just providing services to people, but that how we deal with the resources that we have isn't going into a system that's set up to just maintain the system as it exists, but actually to change the relationships between our neighbors and ourselves, and to do this in a tangible way where we're working with people face to face and in challenging situations so that we can grow individually and socially as a group and as a society, and actually tackle some of the fundamental issues that underlie the homeless and housing crisis. Because before we can even tackle the larger structural issues that we need to face, we need to have the social and capacity and the consciousness of how we can transform the relationships that we have between each other. And this is our model of how that we can at least start to build a foundation to getting to where we're trying to go. So that's the very short pitch of what H&H is doing. Thank you.
Tyler, thank you so much. I'm amazed at the complexity of what Sanford, well, I guess I shouldn't be, but I am amazed at their complexity and how they're not really doing what we really need to be doing, as you pointed out. So I want to open it up to some questions, and if people want to, oh, Judy's going to raise her hand. All right, we'll unmute you, Judy, and we'll unmute Brett when he's second. And let me do that. And then Robin has a question. So let's see. Let me do that. Okay, there you are, right at the top.
Hiya. Thank you for unmuting me. Thank you, Tyler, for the presentation. I've just got two questions. Sorry to cheat a little bit and have two questions in my time, but first questions, I often hear people telling me that just building more housing is enough of a solution to lower rent, so it's more accessible. And you just showed us some pretty compelling data about how there is way more above market rate housing made than like affordable. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the like macro impacts of building more housing overall and how it affects like general rent and affordability across the city. So that's my first question. Maybe you answer, and then afterwards I'll ask the second question.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Judy. I think that is that's a question that gets asked a lot, and one that has a fairly in-depth response. I think the short response is that in a place like San Francisco, where you have so high amounts of money in a very limited geography, and the demand is so high that the normal supply and demand metrics that often go into that sort of calculus and reasoning, you're not going to see a significant drop in rents unless you have just, you know, we're living in a Borg cube planted on the peninsula of San Francisco, which I don't see that happening. So just in a place like San Francisco, I don't think you can just use a relatively simplistic model like that. And also, I think it leads to an attack on rent control, because the next step after that is made, is that, you know, speculators come in, money flows in from all over the world to San Francisco to make money in real estate because it's so lucrative, and a lot of below market long-term tenants are targeted. You know, anybody who does this work has seen it up front. And the reason that rents are below market is because of rent control. So the next stage in that argument is, well, we got to get rid of rent control because that's distorting the market. And if we do that, then everything will level out. And that's not something that I would support at all. So I think it's only a half of a solution. It really doesn't apply even in this situation.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then second question, could you go a little bit more into the progress made with like how many people y'all have been working with or we've been working with? I'm actually part of Hotels and Hospitals also, but I think it'd be great to also just highlight, you know, the people we've worked with and progress we made in terms of raising monthly donations. And yeah, that's my last question.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll add to the last answer too, that one thing I was going to mention is that there's a 10% vacancy rate in supportive housing in San Francisco, which is housing that's explicitly set aside for this, you know, a population of people who can't afford market rent or even what's called quote unquote affordable rent. And so there is that allocation mismatch that the market isn't, not only the market, but also the city is just not meeting. So that's another element of why we need a larger response. And people, we've worked with a number of people, I would say maybe a dozen or so folks in actually in the hotel, renting hotel rooms with people. And right now we have 6 individuals who are housed. We had 7 to 8 people, actually we have 7 people in apartments. We had 7 to 8 people long-term in the hotels, and all except for one person really who was joined in the hotel project as an unhoused partner near the end when we're transitioning to apartments, all have gotten into permanent housing through the apartments. And this is, you know, I wish I could give you the testimonies of all the people, but, you know, people who were on wait lists in San Francisco for years, somebody who's on the street for 10 years, unhoused, somebody who came to this country as a refugee and experienced, you know, very unpleasant things coming here, and, you know, very, very great people and people who, through no fault of their own, were unable to find housing in San Francisco, and only through hotels, not hospitals, were they able to even get off the street. I've been told more than once that, you know, we save people's lives. It's just a huge difference of being indoors than it is being out on the street. So hope that answers your question.
Awesome. It does. Thank you so much. Also, I heard that we're only at 33% of like our monthly donations reach. So if you're trying to donate, people who are watching, you can check out our website, hotelsandhospitals.org. And also, I'm going to post a testimony in the chat as a heads up.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy.
Great.
Okay, please lower your hand and we'll move on to Brett, and I will unmute Brett.
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you, Tyler, for being here. You're speaking about making sure that the money is spent on institutions with a reasonable chance of success, and you're speaking about a larger response. Do you think there is a role for legislative solutions such as the San Francisco Community Housing or Prop K now, right? Do you think there's a role for legislative solutions like Prop K is for this?
I do. You know, I certainly support, you know, what's being referred to as social housing and increasing like affordable housing. And I think that that's can be done through legislation. I think that it's just part of the solution, but I think that it definitely has a role to play. It's just, it's not going to be the solution itself. One thing that I wish that the Board of Supervisors here had done was really not just what they did with the shelter in place was they passed a law saying 8,000 people should go into hotels, and the mayor said, well, no, I'm not going to do that. And then it just kind of stopped. There were other legislative tools I think the board had, which, you know, for instance, passing a law saying that all hotel operators have to open their doors to people on the street or get their licenses revoked. That would have been a much more confrontational approach to real estate, to business interests, to hotel operators, who, to the industry that really has a lot of influence in politics in general in San Francisco and whatnot. I would like to see legislative tools that are really directed at who controls resources, and not just like adding onto, but actually taking a more direct attack at who has the power, because ultimately that's what we're talking about, is changing who has the power and making decisions over things like housing. But yeah, I think it definitely has a role to play.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. On to Robin.
Oops. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great presentation, Tyler. Thank you. So my question is about the $50 a month donation. I'm not clear whether it's for hotels, whether it's for apartments, who the people are, what the numbers are, what the long-range planning is. And I have an idea to pitch. I've been on Nextdoor this entire year because of lockdown, basically. These people support the Swans at Palace of Fine Arts. They go shopping for people who have major disabilities. They're right there jumping in to help when asked. They have a lot of money. And so I'm wondering whether this could be packaged in a brand way that makes people feel really good about the idea that they're supporting somebody once a month. And yeah, I'm just wondering about that possibility. Nextdoor, like mine, has 22,000 people on it, and half of them are wealthy. So I'm just thinking maybe there's other ways to tap into people who might feel good about supporting people, and it would have to be packaged in a way that they're going to like doing it. So anyway, those are my questions about the program. If you could answer hotels, apartments, what's going on?
Right. Yeah. No. Thanks for the question. That's great. So we're no longer renting hotel rooms. Okay. So that even though we're talking about a name change, but no, we are not renting hotel rooms, which is something I was going to go into, but I didn't have time. So we have 6 partners who are in 3 apartments. They're each 2-bedroom apartments. And so the $50 a month, based on 150 people donating $50 a month, that covers the rent for those 3 apartments for those 6 individuals who we've been working with. So that's what our goal is right now, is to have that on a sustainable basis, as opposed to needing to fundraise each month to get more money to pay for the rent. Beyond that, we're hoping to expand the work so that other people can do similar things. As opposed to us taking on more apartments, we could help with other local neighborhood groups doing what we've been doing and making that sort of change. As far as marketing and branding and getting more people involved to donate more money, I mean, we can always use money. It's not, we've never had a problem spending the money. It all goes to housing. So, it would just, I don't envision a situation where there's gonna be too much money coming in. So yeah, I mean, if you have ideas, then I would be happy to, invite you to come work with us, or just pitch us your ideas and we'll try out. Yeah, I mean, we're always open to it. One thing I found is that we've been sustained by small donations. I approached some large donors, and large donors, really, the question that I got was, how does this solve everything? And as a result of us not being able to solve everything, people would not give anything. Whereas people of more modest means recognize that it's just like adding what I can towards a solution really does something. That's what sustained us, which is great. But yeah, people who have disposable income and want to feel good, it's a very good thing to donate to. And Judy, I think, will post like some of the testimonials that we got from folks about their experiences, who they are, what the experience of being in the hotels previously and now in the apartments has meant to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. Okay, Raven will be our last question for this segment, and then we're going to move on to Oakland.
Okay, I just have a quick question. How many people are considered homeless now in San Francisco, and how many of those are children? I live in the Haight-Ashbury, so that we still have a lot of people sleeping in sleeping bags right out there on my street, right in front of my apartment building and on Haight Street. So, there have been some good changes, like the encampment down at McDonald's, a lot of the people got transferred to places of housing, except for 4 people went back on the street, is my understanding through Kristen. So I just want to know how many people are considered homeless now and how many children. Thank you.
Okay. Well, fun fact, Hotels Not Hospitals actually permanently housed almost as many people as found permanent housing in the safe sleeping site of the Haight. Just want to make that little pitch out there. The last count that I put on one of the slides was 8,000 some people in the last point in time count of homeless population in San Francisco was 2019. It didn't happen last year because of coronavirus. The numbers that I've seen for a more reasonable estimate is about 10,000. There were a little over 2,000 people that were moved into shelter-in-place hotels, but a number of those people moved from shelters into the SIP hotels. So, those are kind of the rough numbers that I have that I could give you. The percentage that are children is a very good question. I don't have that number right now. I did, earlier today review one slide when I was, putting together this information. It did have families. I believe that's how the city tracks it, is families and single adults. I don't know if they have a separate children category. I'd have to look it up. I really don't know. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Very in-depth amount of work we have here, and we've got lots more to do. So I want to thank you, Tyler. If you can stick around till the end, I don't know what the rest of the evening is like for you, but I'm sure other people might have other questions. And we're now going to move on to Oakland.
Thank you.
And I thank you so much. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Jenny. I've made you co-host, and you may start talking. Jenny Ramachandran is actually a tenants' rights attorney as well. Tyler, of course, has that same title, but she's been working on the other side of the bay and has had a lot of experiences with different people, and is taking what she's learned from those experiences to decide to make a run for the vacant seat in AD 18, which is most of Oakland, San Leandro, and Alameda. And our Oakland chapter actually has endorsed her, so I'm sorry to give a plug here, but I hope many of you will find her comments very exciting, and maybe you'll decide you want to learn more. So Jenny, when you are ready, jump in.
Thank you, Shirley, for inviting me to be here. Hi, everyone. As introduced, my name is Janani Ramachandran. I am a candidate for California State Assembly in the 18th Assembly District, which is most of Oakland, Alameda, and San Leandro. This is a runoff election between me and Mia Banta happening on August 31st. And it's a really exciting race for me because some of the very reasons I chose to jump into this race was because of our housing crisis, the lack of tenant protections, and our growing unhoused community. So I want to, I know today's discussion is focused on the homelessness crisis, and I want to just briefly talk about, one of the most life-changing experiences for me and why I chose to want to explore more of tenants' rights and work involving our unhoused community. So one of my first jobs after college was working as a home visiting case manager at a community health clinic with pregnant moms and newly delivered moms who were mostly immigrant women or teen moms, all very low income. And one of my first ever assignments was I got a call from someone to meet them outside of their house. We met outside. I don't know why we didn't go inside. And I find out that she just returned from the hospital from experiencing severe domestic violence injuries and being treated for those for about a week. She found out at the hospital she was pregnant. She also had an 8-month-old. and she was outside of her house because she learned she'd been evicted. While she was in the hospital, the landlord had decided that he was sick of the domestic violence that had been going on for a couple of years. He was tired of the police being called and decided to evict them. But because she was in the hospital, absolutely all of her belongings were thrown away while she was there. So I met this woman in a moment of absolute crisis. Because she had been through many crises before, she was far more calm and level-headed than I was in that moment. But I remember calling no less than 22 shelters, 22 domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters, trying to find this woman and her 8-month-old baby and her unborn baby a place to stay. And it was summer and it was extremely hot and unsafe for her to be anywhere out on the streets. And absolutely no one had room. And I remember one time, finally, after hours and hours, finding one shelter several counties away that decided to take her. And so we drove for a couple of hours and we found a room. And I learned that the next day she left the shelter. And that experience taught me that I am never going to understand, and I can't ever pretend to know what someone who's unhoused and in a moment of crisis truly needs to support them. And I can't assume that for this particular person in their moment of crisis, that a shelter bed was what they needed. That's what I was trained to believe. That's what a lot of our policymakers believe. There is a one-size-fits-all solution to housing, to being unhoused, to domestic violence, to poverty, to all of these issues. And that was a very powerful lesson to me, to remember that I don't know the answers, and we as activists, as future policymakers and policymakers, need to make sure we're meeting people where they're at for their specific needs. Because our unhoused community certainly is not binary. We have people who experience addiction. We have 40% of our unhoused community in Alameda County who suffer from developmental disabilities. We have individuals who are survivors of domestic violence. In fact, 80% of women who are unhoused are survivors of domestic violence, and many more are survivors of sexual assault as well. We have youth who have run away from home because home is not a safe place. We have people who have missed a month or two of rent and now they're out on the streets. And every single one of these people deserve different solutions that meet their diverse needs. You know, Oakland's Tough Shed programs is an example of how we did not meet people's needs. And we assumed that we had a one-size-fits-all solution. Tough Shed program and Operation Dignity were prime examples of what doesn't work. The Operation Tough Shed program offered prison-like, to some residents, self-described prison-like conditions. You can't leave your shed after 7 p.m. There's not adequate ventilation. You can't have any guests over. So if you're working, forget about the sex workers that were discriminated. If you were working a McDonald's shift after 7 p.m. at night, you couldn't live there. If you had someone who you wanted to visit, you couldn't live there. There were the number of restrictions made it completely untenable and made many people prefer the alternative choice of the rooms that they were, the camps that they were in at a given time. And what's sad about that program is that it replaced the Village Oakland and their model of a semi-autonomous living situation where, there were better community services. There was more people that chose to live and work and survive in the community without the intervention of the city and police and others. And I think those are the kinds of things we should be going back to. Another thing that I have personal experience with is going to the sites of evictions of homeless encampments, holding up shields when that's what residents want, and making sure that people aren't evicted unfairly from their homes. I remember the first time I went, I've done eviction defense in court before and represented tenants being evicted from their homes in a legal process, but eviction defense of a homeless encampment means something very different and can mean very many different things, and is really shocking, is really brutal. The disregard that the city or Caltrans or whoever's property that individuals are on have for regard for people's personal possessions, what people define as home or belongings, and whatnot. And the East Bay Community Law lawyers at the East Bay Community Law Center, where I previously worked for a little bit, sued Caltrans several years ago to say that you can't evict someone from public lands and throw away their property. You need to, if something is worth $40 or more, I believe, you need to make sure that there is a safe place to access these items and make sure that you can have those returned. You need to give an address, need 48 hours notice before the encampment clearing eviction happens. And these are things that very much fall by the wayside. But the fundamental legal principle is you cannot evict someone from public land without giving them an equal or better alternative. And an equal and better alternative certainly is not Oakland's Tough Sheds program, and it's certainly not a lot of programs that we currently have. And that's important to me as someone running for state assembly and trying to recognize, where is our funding going for homelessness services? We spend over $13 billion as a state on services, and there's certainly some that do important work, but then there's so much that's not meeting the needs of people. I'm not an expert on Oakland's homelessness budget and the recent audit of the program, but I certainly know that it's not up to par, that a significant part of the budget's instead being spent on policing, and it's not meeting the needs of people. Because right now in Oakland, the assessor's office most recently says that it costs the city about $30,000 of funding for an individual unhoused person. When I think of the number of things that $30,000 can go towards, it blows my mind. And when I think about what's actually happening on the ground and the services that people provide on the ground, it's shocking. I live about half a mile from a pretty large homeless encampment, and about another mile from one that lit on fire and ended up burning the Vietnamese Cultural Center. And they're unsafe living conditions for sure, and not being addressed. You don't see, the city often says, yes, we have social workers and we have people giving alternatives and options and case management services. That's not happening. The most recent budget was passed to, increase sanitation to the 100+ encampments that Oakland has. That's a good step. It added staffing to the city's homelessness division to provide interdepartmental coordination of encampment management. That sounds good, but seriously concerns me, because the way that the word encampment management has been used in the city of Oakland under the Libby Schaaf administration often means policing, often means eviction, often means things that are not social services, medical service, mental health services. Those are the things that I would want to see as someone that has worked with unhoused community members, as someone that has defended tenants from facing eviction, and more recently people in encampments facing eviction. And there's some portion of the budget for the level of case management as well. And I would love to know, how that progresses and what they look like. But the reality is that Oakland is losing its Black population. 25% of Black Oakland has been displaced in the past 2 decades. That number is accelerating every single day. Our unhoused community is disproportionately Black. Our unhoused community that are women with children is disproportionately Black and growing every day. And we need long-term solutions. We need sustainable funding from the state. There is so much funding that comes from the state that comprises Oakland's budget, I believe over 60%, that's going to expire in the next year. So what's going to happen to this budget? Where's the sustainable sources of funding? We also need, at the state level, a 10-year plan. We need something that's not piecemeal solutions to addressing the problem. There's some proposals out there. There's one called Roadmap Home 2030, which is, a 10-year plan, it's 2030, that combines addressing affordable housing, tenant protections, more comprehensive services for our unhoused community, and racial equity. And that's one model, but we need to start thinking more strategically. And there's also efforts to, streamline what's going on at the state have been backstopped. There have been efforts over the years there are currently 9 state agencies that allocate the $13 billion of funding that have been allocated over the past 2 years. There's been efforts to make sure that the state has a central entity, which it doesn't, and Newsom vetoed one bill that would create a state office. the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office, said that themselves that this $13 billion in the 9 state agencies allocating this funding lacks strategy and lacks real direction. So we need to change that. And if that means taking some of this power outside of the hands of the governor, that's what needs to happen. I'll stop there. I talked a little bit about a whole bunch of things, but I'm happy to have a conversation, ask questions. Again, I'm not an expert on the City of Oakland budget process. I know a little bit about what's going on, but I know that it was a step in the right direction, but does not go far enough. You know, sanitation is incredibly important. Increased case managers is incredibly it is incredibly important, but you know what more staffing for encampment management looks like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of room to pinpoint what's exactly going on and what needs to change.
Yeah, sad. Sounds like San Francisco is a lot more organized than Oakland. But we can always work on things. Next, I want to ask, do you prefer questions in the chat, Jenny, or do you prefer people just to raise their hand and I'll unmute them?
Raising hand is fine.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go to the full screen here so I can see everybody. And I see Robin has a question. Okay, Robin.
Ready for me?
Yes, go.
Okay, thank you, John. Is it Johnini? How do you say your name?
Yeah, Janani.
Janani. Okay, thank you very much. So I think I have 2 questions. The first one is a quick one. When you said that they can't evict people from public lands without finding an alternative, I've never heard of that because we just see Caltrains come in here and clear people out and then they disperse the community and they have nowhere to go. So I was surprised to hear that one, if you could explain that. And then my bigger question is about the full setup for people to get their feet on the ground, which is healthcare, job training, childcare, etc. I mean, when you think about going from homelessness to a sustainable life, there's a lot of things that people need. And I was just wondering, is that factored in to planning for helping people transition out of homelessness?
Yeah, on the first question that you have, yeah, that's exactly what Caltrans does, and it's illegal. There's sometimes, I remember one of the encampment evictions that I went to, I asked a couple of residents, you know, did someone give you an alternative? And sometimes they would get a phone number, sometimes they would say no, sometimes they say the alternative is the Tough Shed program, which is not an effective alternative in a lot of people's opinions. There is a powerful unhoused activist, Nino Parker, who is unhoused himself and is an incredible mutual aid work for Oakland's unhoused community. He's endorsed me in this race, which is a true honor. But, you know, every time that the city or Caltrans tries to evict him, he very much asserts his rights and says, look at this, and he has a pretty good living setup and a nice camp, and he said, look at this setup, you know, what is Operation Dignity going to offer me that's better than this? Or what is, he knows the alternative, he's able to assert his rights, and I think he's helping educate other residents to know that this is their right.
Is that a state law, do you know?
It's based on I believe it's a court ruling. I don't actually know what the decision was, but I believe it's based on case law.
Okay. And then my other question about the planning for full services so that somebody could actually get on their feet again. Is that part of homelessness planning? Do you think it's being done? What more would you like to see there? And I'm going to name like healthcare, job training, childcare, etc.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of what I care about. And it's an integral part of the solution. You can't just say, okay, here's the home, and that's it. And I keep going back to the experiences that I had and thinking, all right, you know, unhoused individual, person who's been evicted from their home, pregnant, domestic violence survivor, your solution is a house, right? But there was so much more. There was so much case management, medical services, mental health services that this woman needed. And I actually worked with a handful of others in similar situations, unfortunately. And the answer was the same, that we certainly need much more than a roof above your head, but well, people's needs really are different. For many individuals who have been evicted because they missed a month or two of rent, or people who have been evicted because they violated a part of their lease or something like that, and their landlord just wanted to kick them out to, you know, if they were a long-term rent control tenant and they wanted to raise their rent. All of these things that that they try to do, there's so many different reasons. And for some people, yes, it is just a roof over your head. But generally, I absolutely believe in the need to combine all the things you mentioned: healthcare, medical services, mental health services, job training, know your rights trainings, based, when police come in and violate the law, when Caltrans comes in and violates the law. And I don't think that's happening enough at the rate that it should.
Thank you, Robin, for those questions. All right, next we have Zoe Kelman.
Hi. What really upsets me is this situation is such an emergency for so many people. I read through the testimony that I believe it was Judy Wang that just put in the chat. It was devastating to me that we have really an emergency situation. They have these sweeps and they have no place to put people or to even offer them alternative housing. And I was just wondering, there's this RV section down, it's in the Bayview that seems to be run. I understood it to be run by the city. And it seemed like, they had all the adequate support, in terms of a safe place to just start to stabilize their lives. And not as a permanent, but at least something that could get their mental health back together, because of the stress of being on the streets. Is that being funded? Does anyone know about that program where the RVs the city is providing them down in the Bayview for people?
Yeah, hi, this is Kristen Evans. I can answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
So during the COVID crisis, the city was scrambling for solutions to put vulnerable people into safe places because, we had a major COVID outbreak, the largest in the country, in one of our congregate shelters at MSC South. 125 people, I believe the number was, people were infected in a week and a half, tested positive. So it was a very scary time. What they did is they reduced the number of people in the congregate shelters, and they allocated, resources to put people that they were emptying out of those shelters, and then also specifically targeted people over the age of 60 and people with COVID vulnerabilities to place them into alternatives that were COVID safe. And that included the RVs, and it included the shelter-in-place hotels. And so those were city programs that were funded primarily by FEMA and state funding until Biden's administration came in and they announced that they would be providing 100% funding reimbursement, even going backdating it to the start of the pandemic. Also during that time, the city stood up the safe sleeping sites, the sanctioned tent encampments. That none of that was, unfortunately, none of it was funded through FEMA because it was not considered an alternative housing that was appropriate for COVID vulnerable people.
So,
Okay, let's see.
okay, sorry.
Zoe, did that answer your question? I think you should know that Jenny is in Oakland and there are motorhomes in Oakland. Can you speak to that, Jenny?
Yes, I mean, I feel like there are probably people in this room that would be able to speak better to that than me. So I opened it up there.
Yeah, maybe BOBBI Lopez will address that in a little bit because she lives at Oakland also. All right, do we have any more questions for Jenny before we move on to Bobby's presentation? All right, I think we're good. Jenny, I don't know if you can stick around. I know you have a lot of incredible work to do on your campaign trail. Christopher, I thought you had your hand up, but then you dropped it down. So did you get your question answered or?
No, I wanted to make a comment.
Oh, okay. Well, a comment on San Francisco or Oakland?
Well, I want to talk to, I want stuff that Jenny said.
Okay, go ahead.
Oakland has a lot of encampments. And yeah, I'm a formerly homeless person. I'm currently living in supportive housing. And, you know, I wanted to, there is this, you're talking about the law, you know, it's illegal for Caltrans to sweep people up without giving them an alternative place to be. But this law is nefarious. If Oakland had enough shelters, then the law would say that you know, they could force people to go to shelters. And shelters, as you've learned somewhat, are not an appropriate solution for a lot of people. Most shelters are dangerous places to be. You described the what is it, tool shed program? What was it? Tough shed program, as being like a prison with a you know, 7 p.m. curfew and blah blah blah. I mean, that describes almost every shelter in San Francisco. In San Francisco, one of the things they tried to do recently, a supervisor tried to get the city to pay for shelter-in-place encampments, which are, you know, like a tent in a parking lot all over the city. And he basically said this straight out, you know, it was so, it would basically what it would do is that it would further criminalize homelessness, so that folks who refuse to go to the shelter or the safe sleeping sites, which are basically homeless concentration camps with heavy security, if they refuse to go to those places, then they could be thrown into jail. And so I guess I kind of want to know what you think about some of that, because, you know, like when I look at Oakland, a lot of what happened to Oakland is that San Francisco forced out much of its homeless encampment population. They went over to Oakland. I personally think Oakland should sue San Francisco for not providing resources to their population, and putting Oakland in a position where they had to take care of San Francisco's poor. But regardless of that, I fear this kind of like an encampment. I mean, it's great that people are organizing in encampments in Oakland, but like, what do we do? What does it mean when we institutionalize homelessness at this level and be like, these encampments are okay, right? The solution, I mean, people have lots of problems, right? You talk about how people need jobs training and, you know, all these different kind of services to get out of homelessness. But, you know, everybody, you know, the working class in America needs jobs training. You know, we need all that stuff. So like, I'm worried about this idea that, you know, we institutionalize these kind of homelessness entities when the solution to homelessness is housing, putting people in apartments. And that's what I want to know. What I'm sorry it took so long. Yeah. I wanted to know. This is my reaction to a lot of what Janani was saying, and I wanted to know what she has thoughts.
Thank you, Kristen.
I'll be very brief.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But yeah, that worries me too, because I don't want congregate shelters to be the alternative. also know that, I mean, we all know that there are a diversity of needs, and we need to make sure that people have the pathways to housing that work best for them. For certain individuals, it might be some kind of temporary structures. There are, you know, the tiny homes, the Spirit Tiny Homes project for youth in Oakland. You know that they were tiny homes. I'm always skeptical of the word tiny homes, but like it was, you know, a youth-led, independently run project that did work. There are different forms of housing that might work for different people. I mean, congregate shelters work for a much smaller minority of people, but supporting people's needs to get on a pathway to not just tenancy, but home ownership. Like, let's start the conversation there and dream for what we actually want to see. And remember that people's not just physical bare necessity needs are different, but people's actual desires are different. And to accommodate and to respect people's choices and to give people the opportunity to pursue the choices that they actually want. And I think that really gets lost, at least in state level policy making. And I want to do everything possible to make sure that we're remembering that these alternatives exist, and we need to not have, and to never have, a one-size-fits-all solution. Like you use the word institutionalizing it, which is a powerful way to phrase what's going on right now, just to make sure that we give people autonomy and dignified housing of their choice.
Thank you. Thank you. Exactly what I wanted to hear. We have one last speaker, and Jenny, I don't know if you can stay or not stay, but whatever, we thank you for your half-hour time here. And we're going to move on to Bobbi Lopez, who also is an Oakland resident, but she's going to present the bigger picture here. And I just want to say a couple of things about everything that Bobbi does, because I don't know how she does it. She's a mom and has a job with a nonprofit. And let me just see what else. I just had a whole list there. She actually worked on the 2019 to 2021 budget for the city, on the city council side. And of course, she's been affordable housing, working for an affordable housing developer in San Francisco, and on tenant rights in the Tenderloin Housing Clinic. And she worked for Jane Kim, who many of us know, maybe not very well, but certainly as one of our very insightful electeds, and also Rebecca Kaplan on vacancy tax and homeless commission. So there was something called the Refund Coalition and more, and I'm just gonna let you start talking because
yeah,
you know what you want to say to us.
sounds good. I'll just start talking, and then if it's okay for me to share my screen.
Yes, let's make you a co-host. How's that?
That sounds fantastic. And then what I can do is answer, I know there's a couple questions about the breakdown of what shelter options are available. So what I can do is show that slide. If not, I'll talk about it. There's actually about 1,215 different beds available in the city of Oakland at any given time. And it's a combination of RV safe parking sites, which I think accounts for about, it's a mixture of the state Operation Home Base, which was the RVs that were given by the state, and then 3 separate safe parking sites in the city of Oakland. There's one on High Street, there's one on 71st Avenue, and maybe some of y'all are familiar with the one on Beach Street as well. And okay, here we go. I can now do this. So let me just, everybody see this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wait, view, present. Okay, so this is kind of the breakdown. And yes, the tough sheds, sorry, this is from the auditor's report. So the mayor likes to say community cabins, but we all know they're just substandard wood sheds. And I've actually visited them. And I do think that they are not adequate housing. And yet this is the major strategy that the city of Oakland has gone through. I think there's a big difference between the city and county of San Francisco and the city of Oakland. I think there's an advantage to being city and county. We have very little connection with our county, and our county decides to spend its money, 318 million, on jails instead of housing. And those are priorities that have been made by this county in Alameda, unfortunately. And I think that we are at a crisis level in Oakland because of kind of the decision making that has taken place. I really appreciate how everybody is expressing their connection to the unhoused folks, to the homelessness. And so one thing, yes, when I was younger, I migrated here from Mexico, and my family experienced a lot of housing insecurity. It's something I carry with me, and I think has impacted why I've worked in affordable housing and tenants' rights for 15 plus years. I worked for Tenderloin Housing for many years with unhoused folks doing different campaigns, but I wanted to also just kind of name for Alameda County and the city of Oakland, just, you know, we're talking about SF, the whole county of Alameda has as many people as San Francisco unhoused, which is insanity if you think about it. And Oakland, which is a city of 400,000 people, has over 4,000 people who are unhoused. And 70% of those folks are African-American, which really speaks to the need of having cultural competent strategies when it comes to homelessness and housing. Now I'm supposed to do big picture, so let me move to some of the stuff happening at the state, regional, and Oakland. The state, I'm going to be a little bit not very optimistic, and my apologies. I would say this legislature is not our friend. There's been many important bills that have been there to address homelessness, to address tenants' rights. When we talk about homelessness, we think about, you know, keeping people in their homes, so preservation as well as production and all these other strategies that are out there. And there are some amazing bills that were out there, like LLC transparency and excise tax for large property owners, a $20 billion tax on a $20 billion wealth tax for affordable housing. All of those things got killed this cycle, or killed or made into 2 years. 2 years is a slow death. But either way, it just really shows that this legislature at the state level is not friendly to progressive issues or to the unhoused folks. And there is actually a poll that came out today that the majority of Californians are very upset at Gavin at his handling of homelessness, which is profoundly real. I mean, there's a crisis, and it feels like we're just literally the boat is sinking everywhere, and we've got like tiny little, like, you know, wood pieces to put it together, and we need something bigger. Now, there is some good stuff. I don't want to be totally depressing about the state picture. The good stuff is that there's still a very active social housing campaign. The bill was made in 2-year campaign, and it's going to really be taken off, I think, after this. You know, it's starting to take off, but I think September, October, November, there's a lot of folks very active at the state level on social housing. If you're interested in that, text me and I will let you know when those meetings are happening. Actually, David Chu out of San Francisco also has a really great bill that we've been supporting. It's forcing each city to actually have a plan to address homelessness. And you'd be shocked how much opposition has come out against that. But it's a really good idea that each city should have a plan. There's been a lot of movement recently at the state level to push for equity production principles, that, you know, any sort of land use principles that are moving forward should really be thinking about displacement, gentrification, should be thinking about what kind of value capture is being made for affordability. And obviously, I think the biggest thing at the state is money, money, money. And that's really where a lot of the homelessness action has been at the state, was asking for that money. There's the wealth tax, AB 71, that did not move forward. But what the governor did instead, which I'll go into, was put money one time. Let me be clear. The wealth tax would have been every single year, one-time monies towards affordable housing. Regional stuff that's happening that's important to know. A lot of folks, Tyler who came up was talking about RENA allocation and showing how, you know, San Francisco outdid itself in market rate production, but not in affordable housing. Oakland's way worse, folks. Like, Oakland is outproducing. It's actually, Oakland outproduced most of the region in terms of construction, but it was all market rate. We're supposed to be building about 28% affordable housing, and we built 7%. So we are not doing great as a city when it comes to really meeting the needs. Not low income, working class, and unhoused folks. We're not serving any of those folks right now. And so there's a lot of things happening. There's a plan to talk about allocations and talk about strategies. And that's happening in this very wonky place called MTC-ABAC, which many of you are familiar with. It's happening through the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. And I know I'm throwing a lot of things at this, but this is why everyday people should be involved in these spaces. So it's, there's input from folks that really want to see, where, one of the things we're arguing with the plan that's being proposed is that they really want to focus new construction in central cities and transit centers. The problem is that central cities are also where there's working class, low income people. So if you do a lot of market rate in that area, you're going to displace people. So these battles all kind of connect to the larger picture of how do we build and who do we build for. Oakland, we already talked about the encampment policy a little bit. There's a great group called HOG that's been working a lot on that. In the chat, I included a link to the audit. It's 102 pages, but worth the read. The other thing about Oakland, in 2019, a lot of folks fought to create a surplus lands act. The mayor to this date has refused to implement it. 2 years. We refused to implement it. So we have surplus lands that we could be using for homelessness, and yet the administration was supposed to release the plan in April 2020, and we're now in July 2021. And I think that's the thing with Oakland that's really challenging, having come from San Francisco, is in San Francisco policy, when things say they're going to be done, they're going to get done. In Oakland, if the administration doesn't want to do it, it's not going to happen, even if it was passed as an ordinance, which the Lands Act was. TOPA is going to be coming up soon, which is tenant opportunity to purchase. The downtown plan is going to be coming up soon, which is something we should all be keeping our eye on, because again, it's, incentivizing market rate housing and incentivizing office space, and not really, thinking about how to take care of community benefits. Prefab, that's a big discussion. I think that there's a really pointed point about the fact that these tough sheds are not housing. So how do we lower the costs of housing construction, right? Because to make one affordable housing unit in the Bay Area is about $700,000. It's a lot of money. So are there ways that we can think about having a permanent affordable housing space for somebody? And prefab is one of the things that's been coming up. Of course, we want to do it with labor. Okay, so let me get to the state stuff, because that's the piece. So everybody saw all of Gavin's press conferences on homelessness and housing. Personally, I would have liked to have seen a wealth tax every year that brought in 20 million, but okay, I guess we're going to get this instead. So he did 1.75 billion in equity to fund affordable housing projects. There's so many projects that don't have what's called gap funding. They don't have enough money to finish. In Oakland, I know I talked to EBHO the other day, and they mentioned that there's at least 40 million in just existing projects, not even new projects, that there was gap funding that couldn't get constructed because there's not enough funding. So our hope is that some of this money does go to those projects. But even then, the governor's office clearly states that it won't cover 100% of the existingly stalled projects, right? There's still going to be a gap even after this investment. Project Homekey, I think, in Spanish, you say, there's some good that always comes out of bad. The pandemic was terrible and horrible, but one of the things that came out was the idea of housing unhoused people for their, and that's something that's actually staying after this pandemic, is now this Project Homekey, which is actually acquiring hotels and motels to house people. And so there's 2.75 billion for that. How it's divided, it's still the big question mark. I know that the big city mayors in the Bay Area, in LA and San Diego, have been pushing that they get the lion's share, but it's all a big question mark about how that money is going to be divided. But we know there's going to be more money coming down the pipeline for Project Homekey, which I think is one of the strongest things we can do, which is acquire hotels and motels to house people long-term, not short-term. Then obviously there's $2 billion, and this is might actually be coming more to like San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, LA. I believe they might be focusing on 13 jurisdictions, and it would be flexible funding to local jurisdictions on how to spend it for folks who experience homelessness. So it's really important that folks kind of keep an eye on what's happening at the state and how this money is going to come down. I'm not going to go through everything because it's a long list, but I do want to really kind of point at the bottom, 20 million for Baja. So I mentioned Baja before. This is the MTC ABAC thing. So they're getting $20 million to do 5 pilot programs, which are strategies to deal with homelessness and displacement. So again, I know nobody wants to go to yet another meeting, but it's important to be in the know so that you can influence, for example, their anti-displacement strategy, right? One of the big things here is a foreclosure prevention, 500 million for foreclosure prevention. I think that's fantastic. So that's some of the money that's coming down from the state. From the city of Oakland, John and he already spoke to it. Personally, I think there's a really great budget that the progressives put forward, incredible investments into macro and public safety, and actually doing community-minded public safety that I think are groundbreaking. I would have liked to seen a little bit more money go to local to funding to homelessness. One thing that you should know about how financing mechanisms work, and I know capitalism sucks, is that a lot of it is matching. So you get local money, you got to match it. You get federal state money, you got to match it locally. So I really, hope that we can long-term think of other ways of getting more money locally in Oakland. But this is some of the money. There's $32 million that came in. 21 was through one-time grants through HCD. 7.5 of that was our impact fees. The money we charged market rate developers, which should be way higher. We actually charged very little. But this is some of the money. And then we had a one-time 19.3 million in homelessness. Now it's likely we're going to have more money based on this last budget, but this is what we have so far. And then of course, there's a 1.5 million in workforce development, because we know it's just not housing, it's also jobs and a whole network of things that we need to do to support people. Is this enough? Well, I'm going to say no. Because very, very, very much so, we know that the cost of construction for an affordable unit is $700,000. You could do a prefab for 100K, but then, as Christopher mentioned, I think this is really important. You really don't want to put folks in substandard housing conditions. So you have to be really careful about what you're doing here. Now, prefab, we talked to a company the other day that does nice places. So it's really about figuring out, is there something between that 700 and that 100K? But either way, if we wanted to house the 3,210 people that are currently not sheltered, meaning they're not in an RV camp, they're not in there, that would be $2.2 billion just for the city of Oakland. And that's just talking about build it capital costs, not including operation, maintenance, land acquisition, support services. So we really need to think big about how we do this. So, because obviously to really house folks and provide the sort of holistic approach of services, you're going to need at least $4 billion just for the city of Oakland. So where do we go from here? Well, I think we need to think big. It was said by Tyler, and I'll echo it again. Obviously, we need to shift land use policies. That's part of the problem. And also budget priorities. We need to give more and more. And I think that's my presentation. Yeah, that's it. So I don't know if there are questions. Or no questions.
Shirley, I think you're muted.
Yeah, so I'd like to start off with a question, Bobby, because you know so much, and we know, most of us here, speaking for myself, know so little. What would you say? You say we don't want to go to another meeting, but let's say once a week we want to do something. What would you suggest that we do to help this situation move along, or is once a week not enough?
Well, for me, it's two things. And this is my own bias. So for one, the other thing I'm working on the state level with my colleague, Jane Kim, who's again, my colleague, is, wealth tax measure. And I think that that's really something we should be doing, is doing progressive taxation and wealth taxing. Now, that's really a state thing, although, there's been discussion about maybe finding a way that this Baja could become a taxing entity and tax wealth, extreme wealth, right? I think it's about pushing, it's about maybe going to meetings where you can push the issue of like fair taxation, or actually going to the MTC meetings, because they are talking about equitable processes. And it seems so like wonky and like, what's this 9-county regional meeting have to do with me? But it's a trickle down thing. The policy that they set there then impact the cities. Although I also would say that if people want to be more local, there is HOG, which is the Homeless Advocacy Working Group out of the city of Oakland, and they do a lot of really great things. They push a lot of policies together. They advocate for camps when camps are being threatened. So I would say that is another good use of time.
Thank you. Okay, Robin, you have a question. Whoop, I gotta unmute you somehow.
I'll do it.
Okay, go. Nope, you didn't make it. Try again. You got it? there you go. I hear you.
Okay, thank you. I guess two questions. One, to build on what Shirley just asked. Let's say we don't have time to go to meetings, but we might be interested in making phone calls and emails to advocate for what's actually going through, somewhere where we could be advocating. I think that would be an easier way for a lot of us to advocate. So I was wondering if that could be organized for people who want to do that. As in a communication, like a big communication, say we need your help in helping to promote X, Y, Z by contacting this body or this agency or whatever. And then my second question is broader. I'm imagining that there's homeless all over California. Do you know anything about that, about the kind of numbers we actually have? Does every community have homelessness? So I'm just kind of curious if you know anything.
I don't have the number at the top of my head. I did have it at one point. Let me look it up. I feel like it was, I want to say like 645,000, but I could be completely wrong. Oh, sorry. It says 161,000 people, a 7% increase from 2019. So one thing we do know about homelessness, it's been exponentially increasing every 2 years. There's something called the point in time count, which a lot of cities use, and maybe some of y'all have gone out and volunteered to count folks to see who's on the street on a specific night in January. But it's been growing exponentially, and it's a phenomenon across California. I mean, it's honestly a phenomenon across the nation, right? And I think we can all think about why we got to this point. Obviously, the kind of commodification of land, the cost of land, housing being greed-based and not, human rights-based is probably why we're here. And I think part of that is, you're right. I think, let me think about your question about how we do that, because there should be some sort of network, and there have been networks in the past, like that have kind of let folks know when important meetings are happening, because the whole region should know about these regional meetings, right? Because again, allocations are made about how much affordable housing, how much this, and that's huge. So you raise an excellent point. I think I need to think about that one. But yeah, I mean, we're in a crisis. I mean, every city, Oakland, San Francisco, everyone's declared an emergency. It's a health emergency, just like the pandemic, and we're definitely not treating it as such.
I think it would mean making a list of everyone who wants to do that communication, and then you can just send out email blasts or something like that.
Yep. Sounds
good. Yeah.
You're on mute, Shirley.
I guess I have another question if no one else does.
Well, let's let someone else put their thinking cap on.
Okay. I don't see any hands up.
Yeah, really. Okay, go for it, Robin.
Okay, and anyone else has a question, think what it might be. So my next question is, you said that it takes matching funds. Well, a lot of communities will be fairly poor and might not be able to have matching funds. So that's inequity right there in California, if you want to speak to that.
That's really right on. I mean, that's been a lot of how this is done in the past. Has been two things. One, either, like the redevelopment agency that used tax increment, but that was based on having a city that had tax increment. Some cities don't do that. I mean, I think that there's a whole nother discussion that I'm not the best person to talk to about the fact that we also failed in our rural housing strategies and our rural unhoused strategies, period. And I think it's because we create these structures and financing systems that are, I mean, there's a perfect example. There's some folks I know in Oakland who are trying to create like deeply affordable housing, and they're doing a strategy that's completely outside of the existing system, and they have gone through every issue trying to just build affordable housing. Like it's hard enough on its own to build it, but if you're actually trying to not to use these financing structures, it's like near impossible. But I think we need to expand our toolkit on what we're doing, right? Like we should be doing more community land trusts, and we should be having the support systems in place to make those successful. This group is a landless movement, right? So it's very different, but it's still doing the same goal of creating deeply affordable housing for time immemorial. But yeah, I hope I answered your question. Oh, I see another hand up.
Yes, Zoe Kelman, go.
Sorry. I was just reading the Boise decision, the Ninth Circuit, that said that, you couldn't, these people pretty much that criminalized homelessness, right? And so they reversed that. So this is a situation where legally they have to find housing for these people. And I don't understand why, as an emergency then, or they're being sued, finding those funds. They find the funds when there's other problems, by, shifting money from one budget to the other. Why has this not come to the, I mean, it's criminal for them to not abide by this Ninth Circuit
You hit
decision.
the nail, Zoe, you hit the nail. I mean, it is something that I've actually heard more and more advocates, at least in my circles, talk about, is just suing cities using Boise, because the city's not going to do anything unless there's a lawsuit.
Right.
Like they should be, but they're not, right? And, unfortunately, the last lawsuit San Francisco had was from the right? Was not aligned with our value system. So unfortunately, it was done in a way that didn't necessarily center unhoused people, right? And I think that that's a strategy you're going to see more and more of folks actually suing cities that fall under Boise, because there is a legal because then the cities actually have to sit down with the folks suing them and talk about how they're actually going to provide housing, right? So I've actually heard a couple folks mention suing a couple of jurisdictions because of that.
But who would sue? I mean, even the district attorneys wouldn't they sue too, that this is something that's a violation?
I think most everyone has, I don't know the answer who has legal standing. Maybe somebody else may call. But I know that it's a wide range of folks that would have standing.
Okay. Thank you. I hope they do sue. I mean, they should have been suing, I believe, right after the Boise decision. Okay, thank you.
No, I mean, there is a lawsuit against Oakland, I think, actually on the Boise, but it's a community driven. It's actually, I believe it's a group of folks that are unhoused that are suing Oakland, right? But it's interesting how we don't have a larger group of folks doing that, right? Or maybe we should be backing these folks that are doing it.
Right, absolutely.
The Villages has sued it.
Thank you.
Right. Next question, Raven.
Okay, so I put a lot of comments about rent control in the chat group here, but it's really important. The rents are going up higher. I live in an apartment building where I am on rent control, but the people that have moved out have moved out and the apartment's been renovated, and now those apartments are like $6,000 to $7,500 a month, And right now I am a holdout tenant with another tenant next door in an 8-unit apartment. The other apartments are vacant. So we kind of are living under the sword, above our heads we don't know what's going to happen. There are a lot of people who are homeless now because they were forced out of their apartments. And, like Tyler mentioned something about a threat of losing rent control in San Francisco. Other places in the state have really high rents. Like I mentioned, Santa Rosa has always fought to get rent control. And then the powers that be out there, rich people, they do, things that aren't very good to get people not to vote for rent control. And so their rents are going up. So this is to me, this issue of having rent control and making it secure is a way to keep people safe and not becoming homeless.
I agree 100% with you. Actually, in the Oakland point in time, they survey folks of why they are homeless. And 35% of the folks that responded said it was because inability to pay rent. And that if they had some sort of rental assistance, they would not be homeless. So I think that the preservation piece and keeping people housed, and that's a really big scary thing with the pandemic. I mean, I'm glad that the governor has done all these things at the state to bring down the money, and now there's 100% can get paid from the state, which is fantastic. I mean, I think there is still some issues with that process that it's not accessible. It's still online. Not everybody has access to online, and I know I heard those complaints today at work. But I mean, I think the more we can support and promote rent control, and yeah, Santa Rosa, I mean, I know that you guys had a hard fought ballot measure battle, and unfortunately it didn't go the way it should have gone, right? And unfortunately Santa Rosa has kind of become a new hot market, and even your area plan for the downtown area, it did not take into account the preservation and the protection of vulnerable people. I mean, the majority of that plan is in actually predominantly Latino and working class areas.
Right, but I live in San Francisco. My friends
Yeah.
live in Santa Rosa, and they've gone through this twice now
Yeah.
in general elections. And it's just amazing the trickery that comes down to trick people into not voting for the rent control. But I was just going to say that, you know, these entrepreneurs come in, they buy our buildings, and then they renovate it, and then they just try to kick people out. So that's a real big reason for homelessness in San Francisco.
And one of the things that activists tried to push during this last cycle was at least temporary LSAC protections, and we could not get that from the state. But hopefully LSAC reform does come up next cycle, and that is something that people should tap in, because it's still a way that San Franciscans and Oakland residents get displaced. So just very important to keep an eye on that. But yes, the other thing in Oakland is TOPA, like tenant opportunity, the ability for tenants to purchase a building if a landlord tries to sell it, is another tool we can use to avoid displacement.
Wow. All right. So we're coming to closing time, and I know we have some announcements we want to make. And hey, we'll let Bobby start but you just got muted. What happened?
I got really excited because you let me make my announcement.
Oh, yes. Okay, please.
I have been very remiss, but I'm hoping everybody feel free to join me, even if you just met me, because I have a wonderful event for a different issue, which is we have an election for our district attorney here in Alameda County. We've had an absolutely very, I don't want to say terrible. What would be a good word?
That's a good word.
Yeah, you know, I mean, basically our current DA said some pretty terrible things about Oakland residents. So this is who's been representing us in our interests. So we have the opportunity to elect an Oakland resident and someone who's very well known, Pamela Price. And so I am throwing a fundraiser for her tomorrow. Even if you don't have any money, feel free to just come in here and listen and spread the word about Pamela Price, who is running for district attorney, who comes out of social justice movements, and I think has already been endorsed by PDA. Am I correct, Shirley?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
So I put it in there.
And I should add that Bobby, in addition to everything she does, she's also a DJ. So there's going to be music, right?
There is going to be music. Yes. I used to DJ at a club on the east side of the lake. But now I DJ from my basement.
Hey, I just like music, so I'll be there for that. And of course, I love Pamela. So she has a really wonderful, campaign going on, and this will be great. And does someone want to announce something about Saturday? Oh, Kathy. Kathy has her hand up. Go, Kathy. Unmute yourself there.
I'm sorry. If everyone should Google Skywalkers in San Francisco. Ann Blumenthal has worked with people who have been homeless and are currently in SROs, and they do the most fantastic performances. And there's one this Wednesday night, July 28th at 5 o'clock. Meet in front of the Orpheum Theater.
Okay, thank you.
These are personal stories, and they're very moving and very real. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm going to share my screen to show Saturday's event, but before I do that, I want to make sure that everyone knows about the 3 little circles down at the bottom to the right of the word file, where you can save the chat. So if you haven't, because a lot of people put tremendous amount of information in the chat, so you should do that. But meanwhile, let's see, which screen am I going to share? This is the one. All right, can everyone see this colorful picture here? Okay, so Medicare for All, as you know, certainly homeless people should have Medicare for All, but we should too. And across the nation this Saturday, there's going to be marches and rallies. I think there's something like 51 cities. If you have a QR code reader, you can get lots of information, or the easiest thing is just to go to m4m4all.org. And as you can see, we're going to have Chesa Boudin as a speaker, Assemblyman Alex Lee, who was very much into passing a wealth tax. Jenny will be there because she's got a huge petition on her website for Medicare for All here in California, and some other wonderful speakers. So if you don't march, you can just go to the Civic Center and hear the speakers. I'll be bringing the Healthcare Not Warfare banner. If I know more than one person is coming and will help me hold it up, that would be fabulous. Let me close this back down, and I see that Cynthia Papermaster has an announcement.
Yeah, I'm coming to the, hi everyone, I'm coming to the Medicare for All event on Saturday, but at 9:30 in the Ferry Building Plaza. Code Pink's going to do a little skit, or what we call a cantastoria, and it's about Daniel Hale, who's a drone whistleblower who's facing 10 years in prison for blowing the whistle on our drone warfare program. So we're going to do a little skit around 9:30. You could just look for us, look for the pink people. Thanks for letting me announce that.
Oh, you're so welcome. We appreciate that. Okay, well, I think, I guess we're going to do a wrap. If anybody wants to chat with anybody else here, I'll leave the record. I'll stop the recording, and then you can talk with each other about this, that, and the other, about tonight's topic, or about anything else that you'd like to talk about. And let's see, let me